She walked into that room wearing nothing but talent and a white blouse, and they nearly destroyed her for it. What they didn't know was that the most dangerous man in the building had already been watching her for weeks, and when he crossed that room in front of everyone, nothing in any of their lives would ever be the same again. If this story grabs you from the very first scene, hit that like button right now. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in, because this one goes deep. The rain came down like it had a grudge against Chicago. It hit the pavement in sheets, bounced off taxi hoods, ran in dark rivers along the gutters of Michigan Avenue, and pooled against the curbs where cigarette butts and yesterday's newspaper dissolved into gray pulp. It was the kind of rain that didn't care what you were wearing or where you needed to be. It just fell, indifferent and heavy, soaking through the shoulders of Zariah Vaughn's white blouse before she'd even made it half a block from the parking garage. She didn't run. She'd learned early that running in the rain only meant you arrived sooner to wherever you were trying to get. And Zariah had spent the last 29 years of her life arriving to places that weren't quite ready for her. Tonight wasn't going to be any different. She knew that already. She'd known it since she'd opened the invitation 3 days ago and stood in her kitchen with the cream-colored envelope in her hands, reading the address twice, 3 times, certain she had misread something. She hadn't misread anything. The Aldermere Building, 42nd floor, 7 o'clock sharp. A recruitment gala hosted by Harrow Voss International, the luxury fashion conglomerate whose name appeared on the hang tags of clothes that cost more than her monthly rent. The kind of company whose campaigns ran in the windows of stores she walked past, not into. The kind of company that did not send invitations to designers from the South Side who worked out of a converted spare bedroom with a secondhand cutting table and a sewing machine she'd bought off Craigslist 6 years ago and repaired twice since. And yet, the invitation was real. The embossed seal was real. The handwriting in the personal note at the bottom, "We look forward to seeing your work, Ms. Vaughn," was real enough that she'd stood over it with a lamp tilted close, checking for the slight depression that real pen pressure left in quality paper. Real. She'd stayed up that first night making a list of reasons she should not go. The list was long and practical and largely correct. She didn't have the connections. She didn't have the credentials that people in those rooms collected like armor. The design school pedigrees, the internships, the bylines in trade publications. She had a portfolio that she'd built piece by piece over a decade of anonymous labor. Work that had gone out into the world under other people's names. Work that had bought other people's apartments. Work that had earned other people's awards while she sat in the back rows of ceremonies she'd been invited to attend as someone's assistant. That list of reasons existed, and it was valid, and on the second night she'd thrown it away. Because the alternative was not going. And Zariah Vaughn had spent enough years not going places. She was tired of it in a way that had moved beyond frustration into something quieter and more permanent. A low, consistent ache, like a bruise on a bone. So she'd pressed her best white blouse. She'd taken her dark jeans, clean, fitted, the ones with no fraying at the hems. She'd pulled her portfolio from the shelf and gone through it the way a surgeon checks instruments before an operation. Methodical, without sentiment, looking for weakness. There was none. She knew there was none. The designs were the truest things she'd ever made, and she knew how to look at them honestly. She'd taken the train downtown, walked the last 6 blocks through the rain, and now she stood on the sidewalk in front of the Aldermere Building with wet shoulders and her portfolio tucked under her arm and her chin level. The lobby was marble and gold light. A doorman held the elevator for her without being asked, which surprised her. The ride to the 42nd floor was smooth and silent. The elevator doors opened, and Zariah stepped out and felt the temperature of the room change. It wasn't the physical temperature. The ballroom was warm, heated to the specific, careful warmth of places built to make wealthy people comfortable, that precise degree where crystal stays clear and skin stays dry, and nobody ever needs to think about being cold. The temperature that changed was something else, the social temperature. The invisible atmosphere that exists in rooms where money and status have been circulating long enough to calcify into something structural, something that has weight and edges and knows, with a certainty that requires no discussion, exactly who belongs and who doesn't. The ballroom was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides showed Chicago spread below like a circuit board, all wet light, and dark geometry. The lake, a black absence at the city's eastern edge. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, each one throwing prismatic light across the room in a way that seemed to multiply the diamonds already present, at throats, at earlobes, at wrists. The women wore gowns, not cocktail dresses, not evening wear, gowns the kind that announced, through cut and fabric and the particular way they moved, that they had been commissioned specifically rather than purchased. The men wore tuxedos with the relaxed confidence of people who had been wearing tuxedos since they were old enough to stand upright at formal events. Zaria stood at the ballroom entrance in her white blouse and dark jeans and felt, with perfect and complete clarity, that she had walked into the wrong room. She had not walked into the wrong room, but that distinction between the truth and the room's immediate verdict is sometimes the distance between surviving a thing and being destroyed by it. And in the first 3 seconds after she walked in, Zaria stood in that distance and breathed. The whispers started before she'd taken her second step. She felt them more than heard them, a shift in the room's texture, the particular way conversations pause and resume slightly differently, the way heads tilt by fractions of degrees that would be invisible individually but collectively form the unmistakable shape of assessment, of judgment, of verdict already rendered. Then she heard words because the woman to her immediate left was not being particularly careful about her volume. "She's not a candidate," said to the man beside her, chin dipped, voice pitched at that specific frequency people use when they want to be certain they're heard while maintaining the technical cover of a private conversation. "Maybe catering staff?" The man's voice, dry and amused. "Who on earth let her in?" Zaria kept her face neutral. It was a skill she had acquired young, the way some children acquire languages, through necessity and repetition until it became reflexive. Her mother had called it her iron face. Her older brother Marcus had called it her nothing's wrong face and had spent years trying to crack it and had never fully succeeded. She kept her iron face on and moved further into the room because stopping was not an option and going back was not an option. And the only direction available to her was forward. The room arranged itself around her absence, if that makes sense. People didn't step away from her. That would have been too obvious, too crude for this crowd. They simply didn't make room. Conversations formed walls. Eye contact found reasons to land elsewhere. A waitress passed with a tray of champagne glasses and offered them to the couple on Zariah's right and the couple on her left without once glancing at Zariah directly, which was a more sophisticated form of erasure than the whispers had been. Zaria lifted a glass of water from a station along the wall. She didn't need it. She held it because having something to hold meant your hands had a purpose, and hands without purpose in a room like this could betray you. She scanned for a check-in table, a reception desk, any indication of where candidates were supposed to register. She'd expected, reasonably, she thought, that there would be some kind of organized intake process. A person with a clipboard or a tablet, a seating chart, a lanyard, something. There was nothing she could identify. Either the registration had already closed, or the logistics were less formal than the invitation had implied, and she was starting to feel this as a possibility with a distinct physical sensation, a tightening behind her sternum. Something had gone wrong with her invitation specifically. The dress code on the invitation had said, "Evening attire, creative and sophisticated." She'd read it 4 times. She'd asked her friend Deja, who had a keener instinct for these social registers than Zaria did, and Deja had said it sounded like a range, like it meant designer but individual, like they wanted to see the candidate's aesthetic sensibility expressed in what they wore. Jeans could work, Deja had said, if they were the right jeans. Zariah's were the right jeans, except they weren't, apparently, because every other woman in this room was wearing a gown. She thought about Deja's face when she'd described the invitation. She thought about how Deja had read the description twice and nodded. She thought about how the invitation had read evening attire in Zariah's memory, and then she thought about the fact that she hadn't brought the invitation with her tonight because she hadn't thought she'd need it. The tightening behind her sternum sharpened. Something had been changed. She couldn't prove it. She had no evidence. It was a feeling, the kind of feeling that arrives before the mind has assembled the logical case for it, built from dozens of small observations that the brain processes faster than conscious thought can articulate. Something had been done to her before she walked through that door tonight. She was still standing there, working through this, when she heard the laughter. It came from a cluster of 3 women near the center of the room. Early 30s, all of them, all wearing gowns that probably had names, in the way that significant dresses have the name of the person who made them attached the way authors are attached to books. The woman at the center of the cluster had the particular kind of blonde hair that is maintained with such precision that it reads as both natural and architectural simultaneously. She was beautiful the way things constructed to be beautiful are beautiful, deliberately, effectively, without accident. She was looking at Zariah, not discreetly, not with the careful social camouflage of the whispers from earlier. She was looking at Zariah with the full attention of someone who has decided they don't need to be careful. And she was saying something to the women flanking her that made them press their lips together and look away. And the one on the right was pressing her lips together to suppress a smile. And the one on the left had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, which meant she was the most decent of the three. Zariah had seen this woman before. She'd just spent 10 seconds figuring out where. The board member's daughter. She'd seen her name in the company literature she'd pulled up online after receiving the invitation. Celine Hartwell, listed in the acknowledgments of a company profile piece, identified as the daughter of board member Jeffrey Hartwell. In the photograph accompanying the piece, she'd been standing at a charity dinner in a red dress, one hand on her father's arm, smiling the smile of someone who understands that photographs are records. In person, the smile was different. Zariah held her water glass and looked at Celine Hartwell without expression, and Celine Hartwell looked back at her, and in that exchange something clarified. The tightening behind Zariah's sternum sharpened into something more specific, something almost like relief, because shapeless dread is worse than named trouble, and now she knew what she was dealing with. She had been set up. The question was what she was going to do about it. What she wanted to do was leave. She was aware of this impulse the way you're aware of a wrong note in music, immediately, physically, without needing to analyze it. The impulse was strong and sensible, and it rose in her chest with the momentum of something that had been suppressed for a long time, because the truth was that Zariah had been walking into rooms that didn't want her for most of her adult life. And the cumulative weight of that experience sat somewhere between her shoulder blades like a stone she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped noticing it, except in moments like this one, when the room was especially hostile and the stone suddenly made itself felt. She did not leave. She stayed. Not out of stubbornness, exactly, though stubbornness was in there, a component of the compound thing she felt. She stayed because something else was also present. The designs in her portfolio, solid and real under her arm, the accumulated proof of a decade of work that was genuinely good, and the knowledge that walking out of this room would mean walking into the same situation in some future room under different circumstances, and she was tired, at a bone level, of walking out of rooms. She moved toward an empty space near the windows on the west side of the room, not the prime real estate, that was occupied by a group of executives and a woman in an ivory gown who was gesturing with both hands in the way people gesture when they're certain of their audience. But the west windows had the best view of the city, and standing near a view gave the impression of contemplation rather than isolation, which mattered when you were standing alone. She had her back mostly to the room when she registered, through that animal awareness that operates below conscious attention, that someone nearby had gone still. Not the ordinary stillness of someone standing in place, a different kind. The deliberate stillness of someone who has chosen to stop moving and is now paying close attention to something. The stillness of someone who watches. She turned slightly, less than 45 degrees, just enough to see peripherally. He was standing near the corner where the west and north windows met, which was genuinely the room's best position. You could see the full layout of the space from there, all the exits and entrances, the entire social geography, while appearing to look at the city. He was tall, not excessively so, but enough that he stood slightly above the room's average sightline. Dark suit. No tie, which in this context was either carelessness or a deliberate statement, and nothing about him suggested carelessness. Dark hair cut without a vent. A face that was... She processed this in her peripheral vision, then had to look directly for a moment to confirm. Younger than the authority he occupied in the room, somewhere in his mid-30s, but held in a way that made the number irrelevant. He was looking at her, not the way the whispers had looked at her, not the way Celine Hartwell had looked at her. He was looking at her the way someone looks at something they find genuinely interesting, with the settled, unhurried attention of someone who has time and isn't worried about being caught looking. He didn't look away when she turned. She looked away first, which irritated her. She refocused on the city through the glass and listened to the room behind her and tried to remember why she was here. The portfolio under her arm, the designs, the 10 years of work and the borrowed credit and the anonymous labor, and the fact that somewhere in this building there was a person or committee with the authority to recognize what she'd built and put her name on it finally, publicly, in a way that couldn't be taken back. That was why she was here. She heard footsteps approach and stopped to her left. Not close enough to be intrusive. Close enough to be intentional. "You're looking at the wrong part of the city," a voice said. Male. Low. Unhurried. The kind of voice that had never needed to raise itself to be heard because the people in its vicinity had always understood that they should be listening. She didn't turn immediately. She finished her thought first, which was a small and probably irrational piece of territory she was claiming. Then she turned. He was closer than she'd expected, which meant she had to adjust her sense of him. Proximity does that. It collapses the interpretive distance and makes a person more specific. The face that had seemed composed from across the room was composed up close too, but differently. The lines around his eyes weren't from smiling. The set of his jaw wasn't at rest exactly, just controlled. His eyes were a shade she couldn't immediately name, something between gray and green that shifted depending on where the light hit, and they were directed at her with the same settled, unhurried attention she'd registered from across the room. "South side, right?" he said. Something moved in her chest. "Excuse me?" He nodded toward the window, toward the dark geography below. "The part of the city you'd actually know. You were looking north. Nobody looks north when they grew up south." She was quiet for a moment, not because she didn't have a response, but because she was calibrating, figuring out what kind of conversation this was and what kind of man she was having it with. He didn't fill the silence, which was unusual. Most people fill silences. He just waited with the same unhurried patience, as if he had no particular concern about whether she answered. 73rd and King Drive, she said finally, give or take. He nodded, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already calculated. "Evelyn's gown," he said. Everything in her stilled, because that was not a statement she'd expected from anyone in this room or anywhere near this event, and the way he said it, Evelyn's gown, was the way someone says something they know, not something they're speculating about. "I don't know what you're referring to," she said, because caution was the correct response here, and caution was something she was generally good at. He didn't argue. He didn't push. He just looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and she had the distinct and slightly disorienting feeling that he'd expected exactly that answer and was entirely unbothered by it. "The seam work on the left shoulder panel," he said. "The way the secondary fabric grain was shifted 2 degrees counter to the primary to control drape. Standard technique would have aligned them. What you did was better." The water glass in her hand was getting warmer. She was holding it too tight. "That's a very specific observation," she said. "I pay attention to specific things. Most people in this room don't. Most people in this room wouldn't know the difference." He said it without edge, as a simple fact. "I grew up watching my mother work, before the company had money, before she had staff. She used to do the technical modifications herself at a table in the back of the atelier." Something shifted in the conversation's weight distribution. "Evelyn Voss," Zariah said. "My mother," he confirmed. "Yes," and she understood then that she was talking to Cassian Voss, the CEO, the man whose name appeared at the top of the company literature she'd studied, whose photograph she'd seen in 3 separate profiles, and recognized none of those photographs now, because photographs were always composites, and the man in front of her was entirely present in a way photographs couldn't capture. She understood something else too, fast on the heels of that, which was that her situation had just become significantly more complicated in a direction she couldn't yet determine was better or worse. "I need to be direct with you," she said, because direct was the only register that felt honest right now, and honesty felt like the only viable strategy in this conversation. "I'd prefer it," he said. "I think something was done to my invitation before tonight. The dress code I received didn't match." She gestured briefly at the room, at the gowns, at the particular quality of the evening's social armor. "This." He was quiet for 3 seconds. It was a careful quiet. "I know," he said. She felt the thing in her chest again, harder this time. "You know. I know what happened to your invitation. I know who altered it." He paused. I didn't know until approximately 40 minutes ago when I was reviewing the evening's guest list and noticed an inconsistency. What kind of inconsistency? The kind that required someone with internal access to produce. His eyes moved briefly to the center of the room. She followed the direction, and she found Celine Hartwell standing where she'd been standing before, still with her cluster of women, though she was no longer looking at Zoraya. She was looking at Cassian, and something in her face, at this distance, had changed. She arranged this, Zoraya said. It wasn't a question. That's my current understanding. She thought about this drive downtown, the rain, the parking garage where she'd counted change from her wallet to cover the hourly rate because she'd miscalculated the cost. The elevator, the moment the doors opened. Why are you telling me this? She said. He considered the question with what appeared to be genuine care, and she found that she was watching him closely for tells, for the micro-expressions that people produce when they're managing a presentation rather than actually thinking, the slight delays, the overperformance of consideration. She didn't find them. Because you should know what you're dealing with, he said, and because you're still in this room. I'm still in this room, she said. Yes. Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, more like recognition. Everyone expected you to leave. I noticed, but you didn't. I came here for a reason. I still have the reason. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, Show me. She blinked. I'm sorry? The portfolio. He nodded at the case under her arm. Show me what's in it. She didn't move immediately, because the correct response to this situation was not immediate compliance, not with any man in any room, but particularly not in this room, where power was distributed according to rules she didn't fully know, and the man in front of her had more of it than anyone else present. You're the CEO, she said. Yes. Of the company that invited me here tonight. Through my mother's intervention, yes. And you're asking me to show you my portfolio. She let that sit for a second. Here, now, at a party. I'm asking you to show me your work, he said. The venue is circumstantial. Something in that response cut through the noise of the evening, the whispers still circulating at the room's edges, the awareness of Celine Hartwell's gaze, the damp cold she could still feel in her shoulders, and landed clearly. She set her water glass down on the windowsill. She opened the portfolio. He looked at the first design for a long moment, then the second. He didn't perform looking the way people perform engagement. He just looked, with the specific quiet attention of someone who knows what they're seeing and is taking the time to actually see it. He turned 3 more pages, stopped at the 7th design, a structural piece technically demanding, built around a tension in the fabric's internal geometry that resolved in the finished silhouette in a way that was invisible unless you knew to look for it. This one, he said. Meridian Collection, she said. That piece won an award 6 months ago. He looked up. For who? She held his gaze. Not for me. The quality of his attention shifted just slightly. Something that had been waiting became present. Who? He said. Not a question. More like a space he'd made for her to put the name in. She said the name. She said it carefully, which was the way you say the name of someone who has enough money and enough lawyers to make certain categories of accusation professionally and personally catastrophic. But she said it. He didn't react visibly. He was very good at not reacting visibly, she was learning. But the stillness that came over him had a different quality than the stillness before it, and she filed that away. That's the 3rd time I've been told something like this in the past month, he said, about the same person. Then you might want to look at the attribution records, she said, for the last 3 years. He closed the portfolio with care, held it for a moment, both hands on the case, as if it had weight he was accounting for. Then he said, Come with me. And he offered her his arm. She looked at the arm, she looked at the room. She was aware, acutely, with full attention, that the room was aware of them, that conversations had stopped in the way that conversations stop when something unexpected happens, the way a flock of birds pauses before changing direction. She was aware that taking his arm in this room was not a neutral act, that it would read as a statement, that the statement would have consequences she couldn't fully predict, and that Celine Hartwell was watching with an expression that had resolved, at last, from composed to something raw. She was aware of all of this, She was also aware of what she'd told him. She'd come here for a reason. She still had the reason. Zariah Vaughn lifted her chin. She took Cassian Voss's arm, and the room erupted in the kind of silence that is louder than noise, the held breath of a space in which something has just happened that everyone present will be talking about for weeks. Cassian walked her toward the private terrace that opened off the north side of the ballroom, accessible through glass doors that required a keycard he produced from his jacket pocket without particular ceremony, as if passing through doors that required keycards to access terraces. 42 floors above the city was a perfectly ordinary thing, which for him, she was beginning to understand. It probably was. The rain had lightened to a mist. The terrace air was cold and clean and smelled of wet concrete and the particular metallic sharpness that high altitude gives to city air. Below them, Chicago moved and glittered. Behind them, through the glass, she could see the ballroom, the gowns and the diamonds and the whispered conversations, and Celine Hartwell standing very still at the center of the room with her two companions, watching. "She's going to make this harder," Zariah said. "Celine," not a question. She didn't do that. She meant the invitation alteration, the dress code manipulation, the engineering of tonight's humiliation, because she was bored. She had a specific goal. "Yes," he said. He'd come to stand at the terrace rail beside her, and he was looking out at the city with the expression of a man who has looked at this city from exactly this height for long enough that he no longer finds it remarkable but hasn't stopped finding it useful. She's been positioning herself for a creative directorship. Has been for about 2 years. With my mother's health the way it is, there's been an opening forming in the company's upper creative structure. Celine identified it, and she's been working toward it methodically. And she saw me as a threat before I even walked through the door. You created Evelyn's gown. You spent 3 hours at our estate. My mother told me about you before the gown was finished. Celine has access to my mother's calendar. The pieces settled into their pattern. She knew your mother had talked to you about me, Zariah said. Yes. And she knew you'd looked into who actually made the gown. He was quiet for a moment then. She didn't know that. But it was a reasonable calculation. Zariah let that sit for a moment. The mist was very light, not enough to feel wet, just enough to feel the air's texture change. "What happens now?" she said. He looked at her. The city light coming up from below threw his face into an unusual register, half illuminated, half in shadow, which was probably metaphorical in a way she didn't have time to think about. "That depends on what you want," he said. She thought about her answer. Not because she didn't know it, because saying the true thing in this context to this man felt like a kind of exposure she needed to be deliberate about. "I want my name on my work," she said. "That's what I came here for tonight. That's what I've been trying to get for 10 years. I can offer you a position," he said. "Creative directorship, reporting directly to the legacy division, with full attribution and legal protection on all designs produced under your direction or attributed to you, effectively immediately. Trial period of 1 year with a confirmation review at 6 months. She stared at him. "The position Celine has been working toward," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "You're doing this because it's strategically useful to you. I'm not a charity case, and I'm not going to pretend I think this is purely about the merit of my work." He looked at her steadily. "I'm doing this because you're better than everyone in that room, and I've been watching that building's creative output decline for 4 years, and I know why, and I need to change it. The strategy and the merit are not mutually exclusive." She thought about Marcus's face if she called him tomorrow. She thought about her cutting table and the second-hand sewing machine and the portfolio under her arm with 10 years of work inside it. She thought about Celine Hartwell's face through the glass. She thought about what it was going to cost her, walking back into that room on Cassian Voss's arm with an offer she hadn't expected and enemies she hadn't anticipated. "I have conditions," she said. "State them." "Attribution is ironclad and retroactive where provable. I want an independent attorney to review any contracts before I sign. I don't report to anyone with a stake in the outcome of tonight. That means no one connected to Jeffrey Hartwell's board position." "Done," he said. "And I want to know what you know about the stolen attributions. All of it, before I sign anything." He studied her for a long moment. "That," he said slowly, "is going to open some doors you might prefer to keep closed." "I've been standing outside of closed doors for 10 years, she said. I'm done with doors. Something moved in his face. She would think about that expression later, in the weeks that followed, trying to name it precisely. It wasn't admiration, not exactly. It was something more like recognition, the specific way a person's face shifts when they encounter something they've been looking for without knowing they were looking. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a card. Not a business card. No title, no logo, just a number in clean type. Tomorrow, he said. Noon. My office. She took the card, and that was when the glass doors behind them opened. Not Celine. One of Cassian's people. A man in a dark suit who moved with the specific economy of someone trained to move with purpose and without waste, and whose face, when it turned toward Cassian, held information it was managing carefully. Mr. Voss, the man said, I need 60 seconds. Cassian's face didn't change, but his body changed. A very slight thing, a reorientation of his weight, a shift in the quality of his attention, as if something that had been set at a particular frequency had just received a signal on a different band entirely. He looked at Zariah. Excuse me. He crossed to the man. The conversation was too low for her to hear. They'd moved to the far edge of the terrace, angled away from her, and whatever was being said with professional care. But she was watching, and she was good at watching, and she saw the things she saw in Cassian's face when he received the information. It was not alarm. She'd expected alarm in the way that anyone receiving urgent private information at a professional event might register some form of alarm. What she saw instead was something colder, more deliberate, the kind of response that comes not from surprise, but from the activation of a protocol that already existed, that had been waiting in the background for exactly this type of signal. The man finished speaking. Cassian nodded once. The man went back inside. Cassian turned to her, and she had to revise her sense of him slightly and quickly, because the man who turned was not quite the same as the man who'd crossed to receive the information. The face was the same. The suit was the same. But something behind the eyes had shifted into a different register, something that the elegant setting and the careful conversation and the card in her hand hadn't prepared her for. I need to go back in, he said. Stay on the terrace for a few minutes. Why? A pause. Brief. There's something I'm dealing with. She looked at him. That's not an answer. Something crossed his face. No, he agreed. It's not. He held her gaze for a moment, steady, direct, with the same settled attention he'd shown all evening, but now with something underneath it that hadn't been visible before. Something that looked, if she was reading it right, like calculation. Don't go back into that room alone, he said. Give me 5 minutes. And then he went back inside. She stood on the 42nd floor terrace of the Aldermere building with mist on her face and the city below her, and a card in her hand with a number she hadn't expected to have, watching through the glass as Cassian Voss moved through the ballroom with a deliberateness that parted the crowd without him raising a hand or raising his voice. She watched Celine Hartwell track his movement. She watched the board members and the executives and the investment money notice his direction and begin to recalibrate their own positions accordingly. She watched the room reorganize itself around him, and she thought about the man's face when he'd received the information. The coldness, the protocol, the sense of something activated rather than something surprised. She thought about the way he'd said, that's something I'm dealing with, and the way dealing with could mean a dozen different things depending on the context. And she thought about the fact that she'd been standing in his presence for the better part of an hour and had been so focused on her own situation, the humiliation, the portfolio, the offer, the conditions, the negotiation, that she hadn't fully interrogated the question of who precisely she'd been negotiating with. CEO of a luxury fashion conglomerate. Yes. Son of Evelyn Voss. Yes. But what else? Because men who ran fashion companies did not have staff who moved the way that man had moved, and they did not receive late evening messages with the kind of quiet urgency she'd witnessed, and they did not respond to those messages with the cold, activated stillness she'd seen in Cassian's face before he turned back to her with the composed, careful mask back in place. She held the card with the number on it. Mist settled on her face and her shoulders and on the portfolio under her arm, on the decade of work inside it, on every design that had ever left her hands without her name on it. Below her, Chicago moved through its evening, indifferent and enormous. Behind her, Through the glass, she watched Cassian Voss reach the ballroom's far door, exchange 3 words with the man in the dark suit, and disappear through it. He did not look like a CEO doing something routine. He looked like a man stepping into a world she couldn't see. And the part of Zariah Vaughn that had spent 30 years learning to read rooms, to read people, to read the gap between what was presented and what was true, that part was already asking questions she wasn't yet sure she wanted answered. She should leave. She stayed. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Zariah stood on the terrace and watched the city and did not move because she had said she would wait, and because moving felt like admitting that the waiting was getting to her, and she was not going to admit that. At 12 minutes, she went back inside. The ballroom had reorganized itself in her absence, the way rooms do when something significant has happened, and people are processing it while pretending to do something else. The conversations were louder than they'd been before. The compensatory volume of people who are actually talking about one thing while appearing to talk about another. She could feel it in the texture of the room, that particular social static. She was looking for Cassian. She didn't find him. What she found instead was Celine Hartwell, standing approximately 8 feet from the terrace door, which was not an accident. Celine had positioned herself with the same methodical precision she appeared to apply to everything, close enough to intercept, far enough to seem incidental. She was alone now. The 2 women who'd flanked her earlier were gone, dispersed into the room's general population, and without them, Celine looked different. Not smaller, she had the kind of presence that didn't depend on an audience, but more exposed. The performance of social ease was still there, the posture, the composed face, but under it was something working. "Miss Vaughn," she said. Zariah stopped. "Miss Hartwell." Celine's eyes moved briefly to the terrace door behind Zariah, then back. "I want to apologize for any confusion about the evening's dress code." The word confusion was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Zariah let it sit for a moment before responding. "Is that what it was?" she said. "Confusion." A pause. Something moved behind Celine's eyes. "Invitations go through several hands before they reach candidates. Errors happen." "They do," Zariah said. "What kind of error changes evening attire, creative and sophisticated, to something that reads as business casual? That's a specific error. That requires specific knowledge of what the original language said." Celine's expression didn't change in any dramatic way. It was a very small shift, the slight increase in the precision of her stillness, the way a person's control tightens when something is pressing against it. "I'm not sure I follow what you're suggesting," she said. "I'm not suggesting anything," Zariah said. "I'm describing what happened. You know what happened. I know what happened. We're both standing here performing a conversation about it, and I find I'm not particularly interested in that performance." Celine was quiet for 3 seconds. Outside, a siren moved through the city below, its sound reaching them faintly through the glass. "You've been talking to Cassian," Celine said. Not accusatory, measured. "I have. How long have you known him?" "I met him tonight." Celine looked at her with something that was close to frankness, maybe the closest Zariah had seen her get to it. "You understand that whatever he's offered you tonight is contingent on his continued attention. Cassian's continued attention is not a reliable foundation for a career." "I appreciate the concern," Zariah said flatly. "It's not concern." Celine's voice stayed even. "It's information. My father has been on this board for 11 years. I've watched Cassian make decisions based on impulse and then move on. The people left behind are not always in better positions than when they started." "Is that what this is? Information?" Zariah held Celine's gaze. "Or is it the second option, after the dress code didn't work?" The stillness again, longer this time. "You're very confident," Celine said, "for someone who walked into this room without knowing a single person in it." "I walked into this room with 10 years of work in that portfolio," Zariah said. "That's what I know. I don't need to know people. I need people to look at what I've made. This industry runs on relationships. This industry runs on design. The relationships are how the credit gets moved around. I've watched that happen for a long time." She kept her voice level. "I know exactly how it works." Something shifted in Celine's face, a fractional tightening around the eyes that Zariah recognized as the specific expression produced when someone realizes they've misread the nature of a conversation, They thought they were controlling. The position Cassian mentioned, Celine said. Did he specify which creative directorship? Zoraya didn't answer, which was, of course, an answer. Celine nodded very slightly, as if confirming something she'd calculated and found accurate. Legacy division, still nothing from Zoraya. I've been preparing for that position for 2 years, Celine said. The presentations, the development work, the relationships with the legacy clients, 2 years. I know, Zoraya said. Something moved across Celine's face then, fast, controlled, quickly replaced, but present for the half second before she got it back under management. Not rage, something more corrosive than rage. The particular anguish of someone who has worked very hard toward a specific thing and watched it redirect toward someone else in the space of a single evening. Zoraya recognized it, not because she'd felt it in this form, from this angle, but because she'd spent 10 years on the other side of it. She'd spent 10 years being the thing that redirected, watching other people's careers build on work she'd made while she stayed in the same converted spare bedroom with the same secondhand sewing machine. She did not feel sympathy, but she felt something more complicated than pure satisfaction, which she hadn't expected. I'm going to be very honest with you, Celine said. Her voice had changed, not softer, but differently edged. Because I think you're actually intelligent enough to hear it. Go ahead. Cassian is dangerous. She said it the way people say things they've been holding for a while, with the slight release of pressure that comes with finally putting a thing into the air. Not in the way that word usually gets used about ambitious men, actually dangerous. The company is legitimate. His role in it is legitimate. What's underneath it is not. Zoraya was very still. I've known him since I was 19 years old, Celine continued. My father has been in meetings with him that I wasn't supposed to know about. I know what those meetings are. I know who else is in them. She paused. I'm telling you this not because I want to help you. I want to be clear about that. I'm telling you because if you take that position, you will be in his world, not just his company. His world. And his world has very specific rules about loyalty and exposure and what happens when people know too much. The mist from the terrace was still damp in Zoraya's hair. She could feel it. Why did you alter my invitation? She said. Celine blinked. What? You just told me Cassian is dangerous. You've known him for over a decade. You're warning me away from his offer. She kept her voice completely level. But 2 hours ago you engineered my humiliation to keep me out of the room entirely. Not out of his offer. Out of the room. She let that sit for a second. Which means 2 hours ago you were still afraid of me as competition. Now you're trying a different approach. I want to know which one is true. A long pause. The longest one yet. Both, Celine said finally. Both are true. Zoraya held her gaze. Then I'll figure it out myself. She walked away from Celine Hartwell and into the room's interior, and she did not look back. And her hands were steady, and the thing in her chest, the tightening that had lived there since the elevator doors opened, had changed its quality again, had become something more like cold clarity, the kind that comes when you've moved past the point where fear is useful and into the territory where you simply have to keep going because stopping is no longer structurally possible. She found a quieter corner near the east wall and stood with her back to it and looked at the room. She was looking for Cassian. She still didn't see him. She saw the man in the dark suit. One of them, there seemed to be several variations on that template positioned around the room, and she tracked his path briefly before losing him in the crowd. Her phone vibrated. She pulled it from her jacket pocket. Unknown number, a text, 6 words, stay in the main ballroom, please. She stared at it. The please was what got her, because it was so specific, that word. In a text from an unknown number that was almost certainly Cassian, from a man who had spent the entire evening moving with the assurance of someone who didn't say please, that word landed differently. As a tell. As a sign that whatever was happening on the other side of the door he'd walked through had calibrated something in him that the public version hadn't shown. She stayed in the main ballroom. She found a chair along the east wall and sat in it with her portfolio on her lap and watched the room continue its evening. The conversations, the networking, the particular social choreography of ambitious people in expensive clothes performing connection while calculating advantage. 40 minutes passed. She was starting to feel the specific tired that comes from sustained alertness, the kind of tired that isn't drowsiness but depletion, the body's tax on an extended threat assessment state. Her shoulders ached, her jaw ached, which meant she'd been holding it tighter than she'd realized. She made herself unclench it, breathed deliberately. Her phone vibrated again. Same unknown number. This time, I need to see you tomorrow, not noon, 8 a.m. There's been a development. She looked at that for a long time. A development. She typed back. What kind of development? 3 minutes passed. She watched the dots. They didn't appear. Then, the kind that changes the terms of what I offered tonight. You deserve to know that before you make any decisions. She stared at the screen. Outside the ballroom windows, the rain had stopped, and the city below was doing what cities do after rain, gleaming and indifferent, all the wet surfaces throwing back light. She typed, "Are you all right?" She almost deleted it. It was too personal for what they were, which was people who had spoken for 40 minutes at a party. But she sent it because the please in the first text was still sitting with her, and honesty was the only register that felt viable in this situation. This time, the response was faster. "Yes, go home. Lock your door." She read that twice. "Lock your door." She stood up. She walked to the elevator and waited for it, and wrote it down 42 floors in the particular silence of a person who has just received information that their threat assessment has been inadequate to the actual situation. Not wrong in kind. She'd known, from the look on his face on the terrace, that something was operating beneath the surface of this evening, but wrong in magnitude. The lobby was still and bright. The doorman nodded as she passed. The rain had left the sidewalk dark and glossy. She walked to the parking garage with her portfolio under her arm and her phone in her hand and that text still on the screen. "Lock your door." She drove home to the south side through wet, quiet streets, and she did not call Marcus, even though Marcus was the person she called when things went sideways, because she didn't yet know how to describe what had gone sideways or how far. She drove in silence and let herself think. The creative directorship. The conditions she'd laid out: retroactive attribution, independent legal review, no board members with conflicts, his immediate, unqualified agreement to all of them, the card with the number, the text, and Celine's voice, actually dangerous. What's underneath it is not. Zarya was not naive about the world. She'd grown up in a neighborhood that didn't allow naivety as a sustainable posture. She'd spent her adult life in an industry that ran on exploitation and called it competition, on theft and called it collaboration, on the systematic erasure of certain kinds of contributors and called it meritocracy. She knew how power worked in visible spaces. She was less certain about how it worked in invisible ones. She got home, walked up the 2 flights to her apartment, stood in the hallway outside her door for a moment, key in hand, and thought about the fact that she was standing outside her own door thinking before she opened it, which was not something she did. She went inside. She locked the door. She set her portfolio on the cutting table and turned on every light and stood in the middle of her apartment. The spare bedroom she worked in, the small living room, the kitchen with the good knife rack, and the bad overhead lighting she kept meaning to fix. And she let herself feel, for the first time since the elevator doors opened that evening, what she actually felt. Scared. She was scared. Not the social fear of the ballroom. That was a different register, survivable, familiar enough that she had tools for it. This was something older and more physical, a fear that lived in the body's oldest alarm systems, the ones that predate language and reason. She sat down at the cutting table. She opened the portfolio. She looked at the designs, the decade of work, the structural pieces, and the drape studies and the color explorations, and the technical innovations she'd built in isolation with no audience and no attribution and no protection. She thought about what Cassian had said on the terrace. "You're better than everyone in that room." She thought about what Celine had said. Actually dangerous. She thought about the text. "Lock your door." At 11:47 p.m., her phone rang. Unknown number. Different from the text number. She checked, and it was different, which meant either he had multiple phones or someone else was calling. She answered, a voice she didn't recognize, male, middle-aged, with the flat effect of someone delivering information they've delivered before. "Ms. Vaughn, don't be alarmed. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Voss. He asked me to let you know that there will be a car outside your building at 7:45 tomorrow morning. You don't have to use it, but it'll be there." "What's happening?" she said. A pause. "Mr. Voss will explain tomorrow." "Tell me now." "I'm not in a position to—" "Tell me now," she said, "or I don't get in the car." Another pause, longer. "There's been a security situation," the man said carefully, "related to this evening. Mr. Voss identified certain individuals in the venue who shouldn't have been there. The situation is being managed. He wants to make sure you're— a very slight hesitation, the kind that happens when someone is choosing between words and picking the least alarming accurate one— informed." "Informed," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am. Individuals who shouldn't have been there," she said, "at the gala. Who were they?" "I'm really not— Were they there because of him? Or were they there because of me?" The pause this time was the longest yet. "Ms. Vaughn," the man said, "get some sleep. The car will be there at 7:45. He hung up. She sat at her cutting table for a long time after that. The apartment was very quiet. Her sewing machine sat in its place in the corner, the one she'd fixed twice, the one that had produced thousands of hours of work that carried other people's names. On the wall above the table were the designs she'd pinned there over the years. Not finished pieces, but the working drawings, the problem-solving sketches, the evidence of a process. She looked at them. Somewhere in the city, in a world she'd walked to the edge of tonight without fully understanding what she was looking at, Cassian Voss was managing a security situation that had started at a gala where someone had also tried to humiliate her out of the room. She did not think those two things were unconnected. She thought about the portfolio, about 10 years of work, about the name that should have been on all of it and hadn't been. She thought about what she'd said on the terrace, the things she'd meant completely when she said it. "I've been standing outside of closed doors for 10 years. I'm done with doors." She went to her closet and found her sharpest blazer, the black one, structured, the one she'd made herself 3 years ago from a bolt of fabric she'd been given in lieu of payment by a designer who couldn't make payroll. She hung it on the cutting table chair. She set her portfolio beside it. She set her alarm for 6:30. She lay down. She stared at the ceiling of her apartment in the dark and listened to the south side doing what it did at midnight. The traffic, the distant voices, the particular ambient music of a neighborhood that stayed awake because sleeping felt like a risk it couldn't always afford. She thought about the car at 7:45, about 8 a.m., about the terms of what I offered tonight, about what it meant that the terms had already changed before she'd had a single night to think about them, about the fact that she was going to get in the car anyway. She knew it before she fell asleep, knew it the way she'd known she was going to stay in the ballroom, not from calculation, not from a rational assessment of risk and reward, but from something deeper and less arguable. The same thing that had kept her standing in that room with the whispers circling her and the diamonds glittering and every pair of eyes in the place telling her she was in the wrong room. She was not in the wrong room. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. She just didn't yet know what the room was going to cost her. The alarm was set. The blazer was pressed. The portfolio was ready. 2 miles north, in a building that had never appeared on any public registry under Cassian Voss's name, 3 men were looking at a photograph taken that evening inside the Aldermere Building's ballroom. The photograph showed Cassian walking across the room with his arm offered to a woman in a white blouse. The man in the center looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he set it down and picked up his phone. "Find out who she is," he said. And in Zariah Vaughn's apartment on the south side, with the blazer on the chair and the portfolio on the table, and the alarm set for 6:30, she turned onto her side and closed her eyes, not knowing that the decision had already been made for her. That the moment Cassian Voss crossed that room and offered her his arm in front of everyone, the choice of whether to enter his world had stopped being hers to make. She was already in it. She just hadn't been told yet. The car was a black sedan, unmarked, idling at the curb outside her building at 7:43. Not 7:45, 7:43, which meant whoever was driving had arrived early and was sitting with the engine running, watching the entrance, and the 2 minutes of margin wasn't courtesy. It was surveillance. Zariah stood at her second-floor window with her coffee and looked at it for a full minute before she picked up her portfolio and her blazer and went downstairs. The driver didn't introduce himself. He was somewhere in his 50s, thick through the shoulders, with the particular quality of stillness that she was starting to recognize as a professional characteristic rather than a personality trait. He held the rear door open, waited for her to get in, closed it without sound, and pulled into traffic without a word. She didn't ask questions. She watched the city move past the window and drank the last of her coffee from the travel cup she'd brought and thought about what she was going to say when she got to wherever they were going. The building they stopped at was not the Harrow Voss corporate tower. It was a narrower building in the West Loop, older, with a facade that had been updated precisely enough to look maintained without looking renovated, the kind of building that wanted to be overlooked. No signage on the exterior beyond a street number, a door that required a key card the driver produced without breaking stride. Inside, a lobby with two men behind a desk who looked at her with the specific attention of people whose job is to look at things, and an elevator that required a second key card and a ride to the 14th floor, and a hallway that was quiet enough that she could hear her own footsteps. Cassian was in a room at the end of the hall, not an office, a conference room, bare, functional, a table and chairs, and a screen on the wall currently showing a paused image she couldn't make out from the doorway. He was standing when she entered. He looked like he hadn't slept, not dramatically, not hollowed out or wrecked, just the particular calibration of a person who had been awake for a long time and was managing it through will rather than rest. The lines around his eyes were more visible. The jacket was gone. He was in a dark shirt, sleeves pushed up, and there was something different about how he occupied the room. Less composed, or rather, differently composed. The elegant containment of the ballroom was still present, but the context had changed, and in this context it read differently, more like armor than polish. He looked at her when she walked in and said, "Thank you for coming." "You said the terms changed," she said. She set her portfolio on the table and stayed standing because sitting down felt like a concession she wasn't ready to make. "Tell me how." He pulled out a chair and sat, which she took as an invitation and ignored. He seemed to accept that. He leaned forward with his elbows on the table and looked at the surface for a moment, organizing something, and then he looked up at her. "There were two men at the gala last night who were not on the guest list," he said. "My security identified them approximately 90 minutes into the event. By the time they were located, they'd already photographed the room. Several people. Specifically," he paused, "you and me. Together." She kept her face still. "Who are they?" "They work for a man named Drevko Mahar. He runs an import operation out of Detroit with distribution networks through Chicago, Milwaukee, and Indianapolis. He and I have a history." "What kind of history?" "The kind that's been managed through mutual disinterest for about 3 years. He said it flatly, without elaboration, and she understood from the flatness that elaboration was not going to be offered here. Not on this topic. Not yet. The mutual disinterest was based on a specific understanding. That understanding required, among other things, that neither of us made moves that could be interpreted as territorial expansion or public consolidation of power." She looked at him. "And being photographed with me at your company's gala reads as consolidation. Walking across a public room to pull an unknown woman out of a humiliation and escort her to a private terrace," he said, "reads as a declaration. In the context of the world Mar operates in, yes, it reads as consolidation." He paused. "He now knows you exist. He knows I responded to you publicly, and he will interpret that as information about what you mean to me." The room was very quiet. "I met you last night," she said. "Yes." "We spoke for 40 minutes on a terrace." "Yes." "And that's enough." She heard the flatness in her own voice. Not quite anger yet, something preceding it. One conversation, one gesture, and now someone I've never heard of has my photograph. "Yes." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. Not as a concession, as a practical response to the fact that her legs had decided to register what her face wasn't showing. "Tell me what that means," she said. "Specifically, what it means for the position, for the offer." He met her eyes. "It means accepting the position puts you in my world in a way that's visible, which means you become a variable in a set of equations you didn't know existed when you decided to come to that gala." "I'm already a variable," she said. "You just told me I already am." "Yes." "So the question isn't whether I'm in it. The question is whether I know what I'm in." Something moved in his face. "Yes, that's the question. She put her hands flat on the table. Then tell me what I'm in. The pause that followed was the kind that has weight. Not hesitation, not evasion, but the pause of someone deciding how far to go, measuring the distance between what is necessary and what is too much, and finding the line. I need to show you something first, he said. He reached across to the screen's remote. The paused image resolved. It was a document, dense, formatted, the kind of thing that had been prepared with care. She leaned forward and read the header and felt the floor of the moment shift. It was an attribution record. Internal. Harrow Voss Company documentation dated across a span of 4 years, listing design credits and compensation records and submission timestamps. She scanned it fast, the way she read anything, picking up structure first, then detail, and what she found in the detail made something very cold move through her chest. Her name was there. Not on the award credits, not on the public-facing records, on the internal documentation, the submission timestamps, the original design files. Her name, her employee identification number from the freelance contract she'd signed over 4 years of anonymous commission work, her signatures on the original design releases. And beside her name on every significant piece, a notation, a flag, a legal hold marker dated 8 months ago. She looked at it for a long time. Someone inside the company flagged these records, she said. Yes. 8 months ago. Yes. That's before last night, before any of this. She looked at him. Who flagged them? His face was steady. My mother. She sat with that. Evelyn Voss. The woman she'd spent 3 hours with at the estate, taking measurements, discussing fabric tension and drape geometry. The woman whose intelligence and directness she'd respected immediately. The woman who'd written the personal note at the bottom of the gala invitation in real pen on real paper. Evelyn had known. For 8 months. She had known that Zoraya's work was being stolen, had documented it internally, had put a legal hold on the records, which meant she had been building something. A case, or the architecture of a case, or at minimum the evidence base for a confrontation. And then she had invited Zoraya to the gala. She was building toward something, Zoraya said. She was building toward a board presentation, Cassian said. A formal attribution review with full documentation that would have required the board to address the misappropriation directly and publicly. Was. Past tense. She caught it immediately. What happened to it? He was quiet for a moment. 6 weeks ago, my mother's health deteriorated significantly. She's been hospitalized twice since then. The board presentation was postponed, and then he stopped. The only stop she'd seen from him, the only place where the controlled delivery actually interrupted itself. The files were accessed, internally, 2 weeks ago. Someone used a legacy admin credential to enter the records system and alter the flag status on 14 of the flagged documents. She stared at him. They tampered with your mother's evidence, she said. They removed the legal hold on 14 of the key attribution records and reclassified them under a different documentation category, which effectively obscures the timestamp chain that proves origination. Bolshish mospeit. He paused. Without the timestamp chain, the records show work submitted under your freelance contracts, but credited through the company's standard creative director attribution pipeline, which is what they've always publicly shown. The internal evidence that differentiated your origination from the credited attribution, that's what was altered. The cold thing in her chest had moved, had become something else, something that lived in the throat and the jaw and behind the eyes. They saw your mother building the case, she said, and they destroyed it. They damaged it significantly, not completely. There are backup systems my mother used that they may not know about. But the primary internal record, the thing that would have supported a board presentation, yes. He looked at her steadily. Damaged. Who had access to the legacy admin credential? A pause. That's the question I've been working on since 2 a.m., he said. She looked at the screen, at her name on the flagged records, at the legal hold markers that someone had systematically removed in the middle of the night using a dead person's login. It's not Celine, she said. It came out before she'd fully assembled the reasoning, but the reasoning was there, the access required, the technical knowledge, the specific nature of the operation. Celine was methodical and social and operated through influence and positioning. This was different. This was someone with system access and specific knowledge of what Evelyn had been building. Celine doesn't have the access or the technical knowledge to do this. No, he said. She doesn't. Which means someone else inside the company knew what your mother was building, had enough access to see it and enough technical capability to damage it. She looked at him. And you don't know who. I have a narrowed list, he said. I don't have certainty. She pushed back from the table and stood up. Not in anger. She needed to move, needed the physical reset of being upright and in motion. She walked to the window. This building was lower than the Aldermere. The view was different, closer to street level, the city more immediate and less geometric. The offer, she said, the creative directorship. Attribution ironclad and retroactive. She looked at her reflection in the glass, faint over the gray Chicago morning. If the primary internal records are damaged, retroactive attribution becomes significantly harder to establish. Yes. Which means the offer I agreed to in principle last night was based on an evidentiary foundation that no longer exists in the form it existed when you made it. That's accurate. She turned from the window. So you brought me here this morning to tell me the offer has to change. He looked at her for a long moment. His hands were on the table, still, and she noticed for the first time the quality of stillness in his hands, the same deliberate stillness as the rest of him, nothing loose or unintended. I brought you here this morning, he said carefully, because you deserve to know what you're walking into before you walk into it, not after. He paused. The offer stands. The terms stand, but the mechanism for establishing retroactive attribution is now more complicated and will take longer and will require a legal process that's going to be visible. Visible? She said. Contested, potentially public. The person who damaged those records will know, once we begin the process, that we're building a new evidentiary foundation. They will respond to that. She stood very still. Meaning they'll come after whatever new evidence we build. Or after the people building it, he said. And he let that sit without elaboration. She heard it, the full weight of it. Not the abstract professional risk of a contested legal process, but the specific human weight of after the people building it, which meant her. Which meant that by walking into this office this morning and sitting down at this table, she had moved from being a person whose name was missing from her own work into being a person who was actively threatening someone with enough access and enough capability and enough motivation to destroy evidence in the middle of the night. The design for the Meridian piece was in her portfolio on the table, the one that had won the award, the one that carried someone else's name on the placard. She looked at it. She thought about Marcus, about her mother, who had worked double shifts at a hospital for 11 years so Zariah could have a cutting table and fabric bolts, and the time to learn what she was making. About the sewing machine in the corner of her apartment that she'd fixed twice. She thought about Celine Hartwell's face last night, actually dangerous. What's underneath it is not. She thought about how she'd told him, on the terrace, I'm done with doors. Who is it? She said. The narrowed list. Who do you think altered the records? He was quiet for a moment. My mother had one person who knew the full scope of what she was building, he said. One person she trusted with the documentation structure, the backup systems, the timeline for the board presentation. He stopped. The stop again, the same interruption in the delivery. Someone she considered a colleague of 30 years. She watched his face. He's been on the company's legal team since before I joined the executive structure, he said. His name is Warren Felt. He's been managing the company's intellectual property documentation for 22 years. She absorbed that. Your mother trusted him. Completely. And you think he's the one who... I think he was accessed, Cassian said. His credential. I'm not certain it was him acting independently. She felt the shape of what he was saying before he finished saying it. Mar, she said. He nodded once. She put it together. Mar's people at the gala, photographing her and Cassian. The photograph of Cassian crossing the room toward her. The evidence tampering that had happened 2 weeks before the gala, before last night, before any of this. Which meant it wasn't a response to last night. It was something that had already been in motion. He's been inside the company, she said. Not a question. It appears he's had access to internal information for some time. We don't know how. We don't know through whom, beyond the credential. And we don't know what he intends to do with what he's built. She sat back down. The cold thing in her chest had settled into something she could almost name now. Not fear. Not anger. A specific, clear, bone-deep understanding of exactly how exposed she was. How exposed she had been before she ever walked into that ballroom. How the evening she'd experienced as a professional opportunity had been, simultaneously, something else entirely. A move on a board she hadn't known she was sitting on. "He's going to use me," she said, "as leverage against you." That's my assessment. The photograph. The public gesture. "He's going to use my proximity to you as a pressure point." Yes. She looked at the screen, at her name, at the tampered records, at the careful, methodical destruction of 8 months of her best and most powerful advocate's work, carried out while that advocate was in a hospital bed. Something shifted in her, sitting at that table in that spare conference room in the West Loop with the gray Chicago morning outside the window. Not a dramatic shift, not the kind that announces itself, the kind that moves through a person quietly and thoroughly, the kind that happens when the world, as you understood it, reveals a structure you hadn't seen, and the person you've been up until this moment doesn't quite fit the structure you're now looking at. She'd spent 10 years being careful, keeping her head down, doing the work, trusting that work was enough, that if she made things that were genuinely good and real, the truth of that would eventually surface on its own. She'd believed, at a level so deep she'd never examined it directly, that the work was the protection. That being good enough was eventually a form of safety. She understood now, sitting in this room, that she had been catastrophically wrong about that. Being good enough had made her useful. Being useful had made her visible to the wrong people. And being visible to the wrong people in the wrong world meant that the work she'd made, the thing she'd given everything to, was now a piece on a board that had nothing to do with fashion or design or the question of whose name belonged on which garment. She was a tool. She had been made into a tool without her knowledge or consent, and the people who'd done it were sophisticated enough that they'd done it in a way she'd had no framework to recognize. She breathed. In, out, deliberate. She looked at Cassian. "What do you need from me?" she said. He looked at her for a moment with that gray-green attention that didn't look away. "You don't have to. What do you need?" she said again. He was quiet for 3 seconds. "Warren Felt is meeting with the company's IP legal team this afternoon at 4 o'clock, he said. "Standard quarterly review. He doesn't know that I know about the credential access. He doesn't know what I've found." He paused. "I need someone in that meeting who isn't part of my security structure. Someone he won't identify as a threat." She stared at him. "You want to use me as bait?" "No." His voice was sharp for the first time. "I want to use you as a witness. There's a difference. My legal team will be running the meeting. You'll be introduced as a creative consultant reviewing documentation for the attribution process. You'll hear what he says. You'll see how he reacts to certain documents being introduced. And if he recognizes that you know, he won't." He said it with certainty she was not entirely sure was earned, but which she understood came from a long experience of this specific kind of thing. He doesn't know about the backup systems. He doesn't know what's preserved. She looked at the table, at her hands, at the portfolio beside her with the decade of work inside it. She thought about Evelyn in a hospital bed with 8 months of carefully built evidence quietly dismantled around her while she was too sick to protect it. She thought about Warren Felt, 30 years of trust, and what 30 years of trust meant to a person like Evelyn who had built everything she had from a table in the back of an atelier. She looked up. "Tell me exactly what I'm supposed to say when I walk into that room," she said, and the thing in her voice was not the voice she'd arrived with that morning, not the careful, measured voice of a woman negotiating a professional offer in a world she didn't fully know. It was something harder than that, something that had been made in the last 40 minutes out of cold clarity and the specific, permanent anger of a person who has understood, finally and completely, that playing carefully has not kept her safe and will not keep her safe, and that the only remaining option is to play entirely differently than she ever has before. Cassian looked at her across the table, and something in his face, very briefly, looked almost like relief. That was the word. That was what crossed Cassian Voss's face in the half-second before Zariah looked away. Not satisfaction, not calculation, not the controlled approval of a man whose plan was working. Relief. The specific, unguarded relief of someone who has been carrying something alone and has just been told they don't have to anymore. She filed it away. She would think about it later. Right now there was a meeting at 4 o'clock. He walked her through it in 40 minutes. sitting across the table with a legal pad between them, and a second person in the room now. A woman named Reyes, compact and precise, from the company's internal investigation unit, who spoke in short declarative sentences and looked at Zoraya with the evaluating attention of someone assessing a tool's fitness for a specific use. Zoraya didn't take it personally. She was, in fact, being assessed for a specific use, and she'd rather the assessment be accurate. The structure was simple enough in outline. Zoraya would enter the 4 o'clock meeting as a creative consultant brought in to review the legacy attribution documentation as part of an ongoing compliance process. The meeting's official purpose, a quarterly IP review, was real and scheduled. What Warren Felt didn't know was that certain documents had been reintroduced to the review file, documents that Evelyn's backup system had preserved, documents whose existence, if Felt had actually tampered with the primary records, he would know should not be there. They would watch how he reacted when those documents appeared. "He's going to know something is wrong," Zoraya said. "Yes," Reyes said. "We want him to know something is wrong. We want to see what he does with that. And if he does nothing, if he's trained well enough to just sit there, then we learn something different." Reyes looked at her. "But people who have been sitting on something for 8 months, watching someone they care about get sick while they cover their tracks, those people aren't trained. They're improvised. Improvised holds differently under pressure than trained." Zoraya thought about that. At 2:15, she went to a bathroom down the hall and stood at the sink and ran cold water over her wrists for 30 seconds, which was something she'd done since she was 17 when she needed to think clearly. Her mother had taught her, said it worked on the blood, said her own mother had taught her, and Zoraya had never stopped doing it regardless of what she thought about the science because the effect was real. And the clarity that followed was real. And right now she needed everything real she could get. She looked at herself in the mirror, the black blazer, the portfolio she'd carried in and set in the corner of the conference room. Her face, which was her iron face, which was holding, she thought about Evelyn Voss, about the personal note in real pen on real paper. "We look forward to seeing your work, Ms. Vaughn." She turned off the water and dried her hands and went back to the conference room. At 3:55, she walked into the IP review room on the 11th floor. Warren Felt was already there. He was in his late 60s, white-haired, with the slightly rumpled appearance of a man who had been professionally competent long enough that he'd stopped needing to signal competence through appearance. He wore a good suit that was slightly too large for his current frame. He'd lost weight recently, she thought, and hadn't adjusted his wardrobe, or hadn't noticed, or hadn't cared. His hands were on the table, folded, and they were very still. Too still. She recognized it from this morning, from the terrace, from every room where people were managing something. The deliberate stillness of someone who has decided not to move so that they don't move wrong. He looked at her when she came in. The legal team lead, a young man named Costa who Reyes had briefed, who was operating with the particular calm of someone doing something important while looking like they were doing something routine, introduced her. Creative consultant, attribution compliance review, standard procedure. Felt nodded, said it was fine, said he'd reviewed attribution files plenty of times. His voice was even. His hands didn't move. The meeting began. Costa walked through standard quarterly items, filing deadlines, registration updates, a backlog of international trademark applications, 45 minutes of material designed to feel routine, to let the room settle, to give Felt time to relax if relaxation was something he was capable of today. Zoraya sat 2 seats down from him on the same side of the table. She had a notepad. She wrote things on it occasionally, things that were not notes about the meeting, but were physical activity to keep her hands from telegraphing what her mind was doing. She watched Felt in her peripheral vision the way she'd watched the gala room from the terrace, not directly, not performing watching, just registering. He was managing. He was good at it. The slight tension she'd seen in his hands when she first came in had smoothed out over the first 20 minutes. He asked 2 questions during the trademark section, and the questions were appropriate and showed that he'd actually read the materials. And he received Costa's answers with the mild engagement of a man attending a meeting he'd attended many times before. He was very good. And then Costa said, "Last item before we move to the legacy file review. I want to flag that we've had some documentation restored to the compliance system from a secondary archive. Should be routine, just some attribution records that were reclassified a few weeks back, probably an admin issue. They've been returned to their original categories. He slid a document across the table. It reached Felt. Felt looked at it. Zariah was watching his hands. They moved, just slightly, a fractional tightening of the right hand, the kind that happens when the body receives information before the mind has processed how to manage the body's response to it. A single, involuntary clench of the fingers around the edge of the document, lasting less than a second, and then gone. But she saw it. She wrote something on her notepad. Costa continued talking. Felt's face was neutral. He asked one clarifying question about the reclassification process. What triggered the restoration from secondary archive? Was this standard or had someone flagged it? And his voice was level and his question was reasonable, and if you were watching his face, you would have seen nothing. She had not been watching his face. She had been watching his hands, and his hands had told the truth that his face was covering. The meeting ended at 5:20. People collected their materials. Felt stood and straightened his jacket and said something pleasant to Costa about the trademark backlog and moved toward the door. Zariah got there at the same time. Not by accident, he held the door for her. Good manners, automatic, the kind installed over decades. She thanked him and they walked into the hallway together, the natural proximity of two people who've just left the same room. First time through one of these reviews? He said. Conversational, easy. Yes, she said. A lot of documentation. It gets easier. He pressed the elevator button. Are you based in Chicago? South Side, she said. Something moved. So fast she almost missed it. A fractional shift in his expression, something that connected the information South Side to something else he knew. And the connection produced a reaction he controlled immediately, but not quite fast enough. He knew who she was. Not just a creative consultant. He knew specifically who she was, which meant Mars people had been faster than Cassian thought. The elevator came. She got in. He did not, said he'd forgotten something, patted his jacket pocket, stepped back. The doors closed. She rode down to the lobby and walked directly to the stairwell and took out her phone. She called the number Cassian had given her. He picked up on the second ring. He knows who I am, she said. A pause. Brief. How certain? Certain. He reacted to Southside. Time. 3 minutes ago. Hallway outside the review room. He didn't get in the elevator. He's making a call, Cassian said. Not to her. She could hear him, in the background, the shift of address. Then back to her. Get out of the building. The car is outside. The documents? Reyes has what she needs. Get out of the building, Zariah. She moved. The lobby. The door. The car at the curb, the same driver, engine running. She got in and the car pulled into traffic before she'd fully closed the door. Her heart was loud. She could hear it in her own ears, which was something that happened to her in high-stress situations and which she generally found more irritating than frightening. The body announcing itself at inconvenient times, insisting on being registered. She breathed. In, out. Her phone rang. Cassian. He called someone, he said. We intercepted. It was short. 30 seconds. He used a clean phone, which means he came prepared for the possibility of interception on his primary. A pause. He said 2 words before the call ended. Your name and an address. She felt the cold move through her. What address? She said. He told her. Her apartment. Her address on the south side. The car was moving north and she looked out the window at the city moving past, and she made herself think, made herself move past the cold and into the space on the other side of it, where there was only information and what to do with it. Marcus, she said, my brother, he has a key. Where is he? He picks up my neighbor's kid from school at 4:30. He might be at my building. She heard Cassian say something away from the phone. Then, I'm sending someone. What does he look like? She described Marcus in 6 words. She heard them relayed. You're not going back to your apartment tonight, Cassian said. I know. I'm sorry. She didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, Chicago moved. A woman pushed a stroller across an intersection. A bodega put out its evening sandwich board. The ordinary texture of a city doing its ordinary things, indifferent to the fact that her address had just been transmitted by a man with a clean phone to someone she'd never met who meant her harm. "Where am I going?" she said. "The estate. It's the most secured location I have in the city." "Your mother's house?" "Yes." She thought about the estate, the measuring session, Evelyn at the fitting table, direct and clear-eyed, asking her 3 technical questions about the shoulder panel that demonstrated she already knew the answers and was testing whether Zariah did too. "Is she there?" she said. "Evelyn." A pause. "She came home from the hospital 2 days ago. He stopped. The 3rd time she'd heard him stop. She wanted to be home. She understood what that meant. She didn't ask for clarification. "Okay," she said. The car took the highway south and then west, moving out of the grid of the city into the older suburb geography, where the lots got larger and the trees were mature, and the houses sat back from the road behind lawns that had been maintained long enough to look inevitable rather than cultivated. The Voss estate was set behind a gate that opened before the car reached it, which meant they were expected, which meant Cassian had called ahead, which meant the operation of this place ran with a precision that had nothing to do with ordinary residential life. She was taken to a room on the 2nd floor, not a guest room, a sitting room adjacent to what she understood was Evelyn's suite, which she took as either a logistical choice or a deliberate one or both. She sat on a chair by the window with her phone in her hand and waited. At 7:15, the door opened. Not Cassian, Evelyn. She was thinner than she'd been at the fitting session. The disease had taken something from her since then, some of the physical authority she'd carried in her body, though what it hadn't touched was in her eyes. The same direct calibrating intelligence, the same quality of attention that had asked the shoulder panel questions and waited for the right answers. She was in a robe and she moved carefully, but she moved under her own power, and she crossed to the chair opposite Zariah and sat down without ceremony. "You've had quite a day," Evelyn said. "I've had quite a day," Zariah agreed. Evelyn looked at her. "I need to tell you something, before Cassian gets here. Before whatever happens next happens." She paused. "I owe you an apology." Zariah was quiet. "I knew what was being done to your work for at least 14 months before I began building the documentation," Evelyn said. "I told myself I was waiting until I had enough to make it irrefutable. That was partly true." She held Zariah's gaze. "The other part was that addressing it directly would have required a confrontation with the board that I wasn't, at that time, prepared to have. I let that wait too long. The honesty of it, the bare, undecorated honesty, landed in a way that Zariah hadn't prepared for. She'd been braced for the meeting room, for Felt's controlled hands, for Mar's name and the address and the clean phone call. She hadn't been braced for this. "You built the case eventually," she said. "I built it when I understood I was running out of time to build it," Evelyn said, "which is not the same thing as building it when it should have been built. I want you to know the difference." She paused. "Your work was extraordinary, Ms. Vaughn. Every piece. The people who took credit for it knew that too. That's why they took it. It was worth taking." Zariah's hands were in her lap. She kept them still. "Where's the backup?" she said. "The documentation you preserved. The part they didn't damage." Evelyn looked at her for a moment with something that might have been, at another time, in another context, the expression of a woman who recognized herself in someone across a table. "It's here," she said. "In this house. Physical copies and a drive that has never been connected to the company network." She paused. "Cassian knows where it is. I told him last night after he called me from the Aldermere." The weight of that settled over the room. Everything that had happened in the last 24 hours, the gala, the terrace, the texts, the conference room, Felt's hands, all of it moving toward this, a physical drive in a house in the suburbs of Chicago, containing the evidence that could restore 10 years of stolen work to its rightful origin. And somewhere in the city, a man named Drevko Maher, with Zariah's address and 30 seconds of warning and the knowledge that something had shifted tonight in a way he'd been working to prevent. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Outside your building. What's happening? Why is there a man here?" She texted back fast. "Go with him. Don't go inside. I'll explain later." 3 seconds. Then, "Zariah. Please, Marcus, go." She watched the 3 dots. They resolved into, okay. She let out a breath. The door behind Evelyn opened and Cassian came in, and she saw immediately that something had changed again. He was moving with the specific economy she'd seen in his people the night before. The dark suit man on the terrace, the driver, Reyes. The economy of people in a state of operational readiness. He had his phone in one hand and his jacket was on but open, and he looked at Zariah first and then at his mother, and the look he gave his mother was the only completely unguarded thing she'd ever seen from him. Pure, unmediated, without any of the controlled management of everything else, before he put it away. "Maher's moving," he said. "Tonight." Evelyn didn't flinch. "How many?" "Enough to make a statement." He looked at Zariah. "He's not coming for you specifically. He's coming to send me a message about what happens when I make moves he considers territorial. He stopped. "You're incidental to what he wants, but incidental doesn't mean safe." "Where?" Zariah said. "Here." He said it without inflection. "He knows about the estate. He's known for years. It's not a secret, but he's never moved on it before because moving on it would cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed." He paused. "He's decided to cross it." The room was very quiet. "Why tonight?" she said. "What changed?" "The documents," he said. "The ones Costa introduced in the review meeting." Felt told him. "Maher knows we have evidence he thought was destroyed, which means his leverage over the attribution situation, his ability to use what he knows about the company's internal misconduct as pressure against me, is compromised." He looked at her. "He's moving before we can use it." She stood up. "Then use it now," she said. "The backup, the drive. File it tonight, before he gets here. Whatever legal process Evelyn was building toward, start it now." "It's not that fast." "Make it that fast." Her voice came out with an edge she hadn't planned but didn't walk back. "You have a company attorney. You have a documentation chain. You have a physical backup that has never been networked. File an emergency injunction, file a complaint, file whatever you need to file to put those records into a legal process where destroying them becomes obstruction instead of just records management." She looked at him steadily. "Do it in the next hour, before whatever Maher is sending gets here, and then it doesn't matter what happens here tonight. The records are protected. The case is started. He can't stop it." The room held. Cassian looked at her. His mother looked at her. Something passed between them. Cassian and Evelyn, a look she wasn't part of. The compressed communication of two people who have known each other long enough that full sentences are sometimes optional. Then Cassian took out his phone. He made a call. Short, direct, and from the first sentence she could tell it was a person he'd woken up and who was alert immediately, which meant it was a person who expected to be woken and was prepared for it. "I need an emergency IP filing," he said. "Tonight." "Yes, tonight." "I have physical documentation at the estate. Yes, the drive Evelyn secured. I need it filed and time-stamped and in the system of record before midnight." A pause. "I don't care what it costs." "Yes." He hung up. He looked at her. "The attorney is 20 minutes away," he said. "Then we have 20 minutes," she said. "And then, whatever Maher sends, the records are already gone from reach." He looked at her for a long moment. Evelyn made a sound from her chair. Not quite a laugh, something more private than that, something that seemed to belong to a thought she was having rather than the room. "Cassian," Evelyn said, "go get the drive." He went. Zariah stood in the center of the sitting room in her black blazer with her heart loud in her ears again, and she breathed, and outside the estate's windows the night had fully come down over the suburb, and the grounds were dark beyond the lit perimeter. And somewhere in the city a man was moving toward this house, with enough people to make a statement. Her phone buzzed. Marcus again. "Where are you?" "I need you to tell me where you are right now." She looked at the text for a moment. She typed, "I'm safe. I'm somewhere I need to be. I'll call you when it's done." She put the phone in her pocket. She heard distantly from somewhere in the house below the sound of the security system changing registers. Not an alarm, something subtler, the particular shift of a system moving from standard monitoring into a heightened state. More sensors active, more responses armed. Cassian came back into the room with a small drive in his hand and his phone already up, already talking to the attorney who was 20 minutes away and clearly asking about what he needed to have ready when he arrived. He handed her the drive. She looked at it. Small, ordinary. The kind of thing you could hold in a closed fist and lose in a coat pocket. Containing 10 years. She held it. And then every light in the estate went out. Not a flicker. Not a power surge warning. Instant and total. The kind of darkness that only happens when something is cut deliberately. And in the first second of it, she heard Cassian's voice. Not loud, not panicked. The same controlled register, but faster now. Stripped of anything non-essential. Saying 2 words into his phone. They're here. And somewhere below them, at the estate's eastern perimeter, something that was not thunder and not a car backfiring produced a sound that moved through the house's structure and into the floor beneath her feet and up through her legs and into her chest, where her heart was already. The darkness lasted 4 seconds. Then the backup generators engaged and the estate came back in amber. Not the full light of before, but enough. Emergency circuits, hallway strips, the security panel at the end of the corridor throwing a red pulse that painted the walls in slow, even intervals. Cassian was already moving. He crossed to the sitting room door in 3 steps and put his body against the frame. Not hiding behind it, using it, the way someone uses cover who has used cover before and doesn't have to think about it. He had a phone in one hand and she couldn't see what was in the other until the amber light caught the angle and she understood what she was looking at. And the part of her that had grown up on 73rd and King Drive, the part that had learned young to read the weight of certain silences, registered it without drama. "Stay with Evelyn," he said. Not loud, very clear. "The drive," she said. It was still in her hand. She'd closed her fist around it when the lights went out, and she hadn't opened it since. Small and solid and dense with everything it contained. "Keep it," he said. And then he was gone into the hallway, moving with that terrible economy, and she stood in the red pulse sitting room and heard his footsteps recede toward the staircase. Evelyn said, "Come here." She was still in her chair. She had not moved during any of it. Not the darkness, not the sound from below, not Cassian's exit. She sat in her robe with her hands in her lap and her spine straight and looked at Zariah with the same calibrating directness she'd shown at the fitting session 14 months ago, which felt like it had happened to different people in a different city. Zariah crossed to her, sat on the ottoman near her feet, which brought them level, which was either instinct or the only available surface. "Has this happened before?" she said. "The power being cut?" "No." Evelyn's voice was composed, the composition of someone who had made peace with certain categories of possibility and was drawing on that peace now. "This is new. Cassian has managed situations before. But here, in this house," she paused. "This is Mar making a decision that can't be unmade." Below them, the house was not silent. There were sounds moving through its structure, controlled sounds, the sounds of people moving with purpose in the dark, the kind of sounds that are closer to professional choreography than to chaos. She could hear voices, not words, the short transmissions of people using radio, and somewhere further away at the estate's edge, something that might have been breaking glass. She tightened her fist around the drive. "The attorney," she said. "Cassian's people will have redirected him. He won't come to the main entrance." Evelyn looked at her. "If you're asking whether the filing will still happen tonight, yes. Cassian is very good at making sure things happen when he intends them to happen. Whatever else tonight becomes, that part will be done before it's over." Zariah breathed, the drive in her hand. Evelyn's certainty, which was not the certainty of someone who didn't understand the danger. It was the other kind, the more expensive kind, earned by someone who had stood in the proximity of danger long enough to know what she could and couldn't control within it. She thought about her mother, about double shifts and the cutting table, about the sewing machine she'd fixed twice, and the spare bedroom that had held a decade of work that had left her hands without her name on it. She thought about Celine Hartwell's face. Actually dangerous. As if that was the thing that should have made Zariah run. As if Zariah had ever lived in a world where the dangerous people weren't already in the room with her, just distributed differently. A sound from directly below. Sharp and close. Then a voice. Cassian's, carrying through the floor of the old house. Not the words, but the register. Controlled, issuing instructions. Then another voice she didn't know. Higher, followed by something that wasn't words. Evelyn's hands tightened in her lap. Just slightly, just enough to show. Zariah stood up. "Is there another way out of this wing?" The service corridor behind the wardrobe connects to the east stairwell. Evelyn looked at her. I'm not going anywhere. I know you're not. I'm asking so I know the layout. Something moved in Evelyn's eyes. Service corridor, east stairwell. East stairwell comes out at the ground floor opposite the kitchen. The kitchen has an exterior door to the grounds that the main security system monitors separately. It will have stayed live when the main power was cut. Zoraya filed it. She moved to the sitting room door and put her ear near the frame and listened. The sounds from below had changed their texture. Less movement, more concentration, the way sound shifts when something has stopped being in process and has become something else, something more static and more deliberate. She heard Cassian's voice again, closer now, coming up, coming. He came through the door with a cut on his jaw that had bled down his neck and soaked into his collar, and with the expression of a man who has done something he will not be describing in detail tonight, or possibly ever, and he crossed directly to his mother and looked at her with that same unguarded look, cataloging her, confirming her. You're all right, he said. To Evelyn, not a question. I'm all right. She met his eyes. You're not. I'm manageable. He straightened and looked at Zoraya, in the amber emergency light with the blood on his jaw. He looked different from every other version of him she'd encountered since yesterday. Less like the CEO, less like the controlled man on the terrace, less like the person who had sat across a conference table and delivered information with careful precision. He looked like what he was, finally and without the architecture of performance around it. He looked like a man who had just come in from a fight and was still in the room it had put him in, metabolically and psychologically, and was managing the distance between that room and this one in real time. How many? She said. 4 came over the east wall, 2 to the north entrance as distraction. He looked at the drive in her hand. My people have all 6. The attorney is in the south wing, Reyes is with him and the documentation, Evelyn's backup system, everything. He paused. It's being filed now. The timestamp will be tonight. Whatever happens after this, the records are in. She opened her hand and looked at the drive. 10 years. She held it out to him. He looked at it, then at her. Keep it. That one's a copy. The attorney has the original materials. She closed her hand again. The 3 of them stayed in the amber-lit sitting room while the house reassembled itself around them. She could hear it, the gradual return of controlled sound, the radio transmissions going from urgent to routine, the front gate being addressed, the sound of a vehicle she didn't recognize arriving, and then voices she didn't know conducting themselves with the specific professional neutrality of official presence. Police? She said. Selected contacts, Cassian said, which was not an answer and was also a complete one. Evelyn made a sound. Not quite a laugh this time either, more like an exhalation that carried something complex inside it. Cassian, sit down. You've been standing like you're about to do something for the last 5 minutes, and there's nothing left to do. He looked at his mother. Something moved through his face. The thing that was always underneath the rest of it, she'd caught glimpses since yesterday. The thing that didn't have the name of any of his professional roles. He sat. On the edge of the ottoman she'd vacated, forearms on his knees, hands hanging. The cut on his jaw was drying. He looked at the floor for a moment, and then he looked up and he looked at Zoraya, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything. Evelyn watched them both. I'm going to my room, Evelyn said. I'm tired, and I've decided that what happens next can happen without my supervision. She stood, and Zoraya moved to help her, and she received the help without ceremony and without pride, and without the specific performance of refusing help that people sometimes do when they want to be seen managing. She just let Zoraya steady her arm for the 3 steps to the doorway. Then she stopped. Miss Vaughn, she said. Zoraya, she said. Evelyn looked at her. Zoraya, the collection you'll build, the first one, under your own name. I want to see it before it shows anywhere else. Before the press, before the buyers. She paused. That's a request, not an instruction. Zoraya held her gaze. You'll see it first. Evelyn nodded once, as if that settled something. She went through the door and it closed behind her, and the room was quieter without her, which was a specific quality that some people carry. Their absence reshapes a space. Zoraya turned back to Cassian. He was still on the ottoman's edge. He'd put his hands together and was looking at them. The cut on his jaw had a dried track of blood beneath it that caught the amber light, and she thought about asking if he'd had it looked at, and then thought he was not a person who needed to be asked that. He would address it when he addressed it. "Mar," she said, "what happens to him?" He was quiet for a moment. Tonight changes the calculation significantly. Moving on the estate crosses a line that his own structure won't forgive easily. The people he works with have rules, not ethical ones, but operational. Rules about visibility and exposure and what draws official attention. He paused. He exposed himself tonight. The people he works with will address that in their own way and on their own timeline. That's not the same as being stopped. No. He looked up. It's the same as being significantly weakened and significantly motivated to not compound his exposure by continuing to move against me. He paused. Which includes anything connected to me. She let that sit. And Warren felt. Reyes has everything she needs. The credential access logs, the document alteration timestamps, his phone records from tonight. He'll be given the opportunity to cooperate with the full attribution review or face the consequences of not cooperating. His voice was flat on that, the flat of someone who has made peace with the mechanics of certain outcomes. He's not a hard man. He did what he did because Mar had something on him, and he was afraid, and he made a choice that fear made feel necessary. That's not a defense, but it's a context. She thought about Felt's hands on the table, the involuntary clench, the thing that had shown through despite all the decades of professional composure. She thought about fear and what it made people do, the specific architecture of choices constructed under it. And she thought about the last 48 hours of her own life and how she would describe, if asked, the things she'd done and why she'd done them. She sat down on the chair Evelyn had vacated. "Tell me something," she said. He looked at her. "Last night on the terrace, when you offered me your arm." She held his gaze. "Was any part of that because of Mar? Because of the situation you were already managing? Because having a public connection to someone new would complicate his read on your position?" The question landed in the room and stayed there. He didn't answer immediately, and she respected him for it, for not reaching for an easy denial, for actually sitting with the question and what it deserved. "There's an honest answer and a comfortable answer," he said finally. "I don't need comfortable. The honest answer is that when I walked across that room, I was not thinking about Mar." He looked at her steadily. "I was thinking about a woman standing in the middle of a room full of people who had decided she was invisible, holding a water glass she didn't need with her chin absolutely level." He paused. "That's what I was thinking about." She let that sit. "And afterward," she said, "when you were thinking more clearly, afterward I understood that my public response to you would register in certain ways in certain circles." "Yes." His voice was even. "I won't tell you that realization made me regret the decision, because it didn't." "Why not?" "Because the decision was right independent of the consequences." He looked at her. "You were the best person in that room. You were being treated like you were less than the worst one. That was the only thing I was responding to when I moved." She looked at him for a long time, at the cut drying on his jaw, at his hands, which were still, the way everything about him was still when he'd decided not to move. She thought about what she'd told him on the terrace, which felt like it had been said by someone with less information than she currently had. "I've been standing outside of closed doors for 10 years. I'm done with doors." She thought about the doors she'd walked through in the last 24 hours, and what had been on the other side of each one. "I need to call my brother," she said. "Of course." She stepped into the hallway and called Marcus, and when he picked up, she could hear in the first syllable of her name, the way he said it, compressed and taut, the full weight of the last several hours on his end, the man who'd shown up at her building and been redirected by someone he didn't know, who'd been waiting in a car somewhere in the city with no information, and his little sister's last text saying, "Please, Marcus, go." "I'm all right," she said, before he could say anything else. "Where are you?" "I'll explain everything. I'm safe. She stopped. She looked at the hallway, the amber light, the old house reestablishing its quiet around her. "I'm somewhere I ended up. It's a long story." "Are you in trouble?" She thought about how to answer that. "I was," she said. "I think it's changing." She paused. "I need you to not ask me anything else tonight. I need you to go home and I'll come tomorrow and I'll tell you everything." A long pause on his end. She could hear him breathing. She could hear, behind his breathing, the specific silence of an older brother who is exercising every available piece of self-control to honor a request he doesn't want to honor. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow. I'll bring food." "You'd better bring a lot of it," he said, "because this story better be worth the night I just had." She felt something release in her chest. "It's worth it," she said. "Marcus, it's actually worth it." He said her name once more, the way he'd said it since they were kids. The way that meant, "I love you and don't scare me and you'd better be right," all in the same syllable, and then he hung up. She stood in the hallway for a moment, breathed. The house around her was settling. She could hear, from various directions, the sounds of a large and complex space re-entering its ordinary register. Someone in the kitchen, the low exchange of voices at the main entrance, a door somewhere closing with the quiet authority of something secured rather than something finished. She went back into the sitting room. Cassian had moved to the window. He was standing where she'd stood at the aldermere, looking at the dark grounds of the estate, the perimeter lights showing the lawn's edges, and beyond them, the old trees, their leaves black against the dark sky. She stood beside him, not close, but not far. "The position," she said. He turned his head slightly, listening. "The offer. Creative directorship, legacy division, full attribution retroactive where provable." She looked at the grounds. "Is it still on the table? After tonight? After all of this?" "Yes," he said, without hesitation. "The board is going to push back when the attribution review opens, when Felt's involvement becomes known, when Celine's manipulation of the gala invitation becomes part of the record." She paused. "Jeffrey Hartwell is going to fight this." "Jeffrey Hartwell has been on that board at my mother's invitation for 11 years, Cassian said. "My mother's health does not change the architecture of how this board operates. I run this company. I have run it for 7 years. The board advises. It does not decide." He paused. "And when my mother recovers sufficiently to appear before it and present what she built, which she will do, because she is the most stubborn person I have ever known, and she has decided she is going to do it, Jeffrey Hartwell will find that his position has become considerably less comfortable than it's been." Zaria looked at the dark lawn. She thought about Celine, about the specific anguish she'd seen move across Celine's face in the ballroom. Fast, controlled, quickly recovered. 2 years of work redirected in a single evening. She did not feel satisfaction about it. She'd expected to, somewhere in the last 24 hours, to feel the clean completion of a justice delivered. She didn't feel that. She felt something more tired and more honest than satisfaction. The understanding that Celine had operated in a world that had taught her that this was how you built things, through positioning and access and the strategic management of who got into which rooms. And that the world that had taught Celine that had also been the world that had taken 10 years of Zariah's work and moved it sideways into other people's careers. They'd both been shaped by the same broken system. The difference was where they'd landed in it. "She should have been a designer," Zariah said. Cassian looked at her. "Celine? She's brilliant at the structural stuff. The positioning, the analysis, the way she reads a room and maps its power distribution in real time." She paused. "If she'd put that intelligence into creative work instead of politics, she'd have been extraordinary." He was quiet for a moment. "You're being generous." "I'm being accurate." She looked at him. "Generous would be forgiving the invitation. I haven't done that yet." Something that was closer to a real expression than anything she'd seen from him crossed his face. Not quite a smile. Something more textured, with more history in it. "No," he said. "That would take time." "Yes, it would." They stood at the window while the estate's night settled around them, and the last of the operational sounds resolved into ordinary house sounds, and Chicago sat out there beyond the trees, enormous and indifferent, and full of people living inside consequences they'd chosen, and consequences that had chosen them. She thought about the collection, the first one that would carry her name publicly, above the designs, in the catalogs, on the hang tags. She'd had the architecture of it in her head for 3 years, not in the way you plan something abstractly, but in the way you know something that's already made, already complete, waiting only for the conditions in which to exist. She could see the opening piece, the structural premise, the way the first silhouette would establish the logic that the rest of the collection would develop. She'd been waiting to have the conditions. The conditions were arriving. They were arriving through violence and manipulation and the specific corrosive damage that power does to people who use it without ethics. And they were arriving through a sick woman's stubborn 8 months of careful documentation and through a man walking across a room because a woman's chin was level, and they were not arriving cleanly or simply or without cost. But they were arriving. "I'm going to need studio space," she said. He turned from the window. "I know a building, West Loop, good light. The company owns the 4th floor currently, but we've been underusing it for 2 years. I'm not working in a building you own. The lease would be in your name, independent of the company structure. The directorship and the studio would be legally separate." She looked at him. "You thought about this before tonight." "I thought about several things before tonight." He held her gaze. "Some of them were logistical." She let the implication sit without addressing it directly, which felt like the correct response for this specific moment in the middle of this specific night. "The studio," she said. "I'll look at it. I'm not agreeing to anything I haven't seen. I wouldn't expect you to." She looked down at her hand, still closed around the drive. She opened it, looked at the small, ordinary object and everything it contained, not just the evidence, not just the documentation of 10 years of stolen credit. The proof that the work had existed in the first place. That she had made things, real and specific and technically demanding and genuinely good, and that the making of them was documented and dated and preserved regardless of what anyone had done to obscure it. The work had survived, not without damage, not without cost, but it had survived. She put the drive in her blazer pocket. "I want to see Evelyn before I leave," she said. "She'll be awake. She doesn't sleep well." He said it without inflection, but she heard what was underneath it. The specific quality of helplessness that a person carries when someone they love is diminishing, and there is nothing sufficient they can do about it. "I'll tell her about the collection," she said. "The opening piece. She should know what she built toward." He looked at her for a moment. The amber light was softer now. Someone had adjusted the emergency system back toward standard levels, and the room was almost normal, almost the way it might look on an ordinary night in an ordinary house. He looked, in this light, like someone she had known for longer than 36 hours. She didn't know how to account for that. She suspected it would take time and distance to understand it properly, which was fine. She had time. She had just acquired considerably more of it than she'd had 2 days ago. "Thank you," he said, simply, without the management of it. "For the filing, for the meeting, for staying in the building when I asked." She held his gaze. "You said please." Something moved in his face. "I don't do that often." "I noticed." The night stretched around them, and she let the room hold the weight of everything that had happened in it without trying to resolve it into something neater or more manageable than it actually was. Some things couldn't be made neat. Some nights were exactly as complicated as they were, and the best you could do was stand inside them and breathe, and let the morning be a different thing when it came. She left him at the window and went to find Evelyn. Evelyn was in her room, in bed now, propped on pillows with a lamp on, and a book face down on the covers beside her that she clearly hadn't been reading. She looked at Zariah when she came in the way she'd looked at her at the fitting session, the measuring quality, present even now, even diminished, the intelligence that the illness hadn't touched. Zariah sat in the chair by the bed. She told her about the opening piece, the structural premise, the way the first silhouette would carry in its architecture the logic of everything that had followed from it, the tension in the internal geometry that resolved at the surface, the thing that was invisible unless you knew to look for it, and was undeniable once you did. Evelyn listened. Her hands were still on the covers and her eyes were on Zariah, and she didn't interrupt. When Zariah finished, the room was quiet for a moment. "The shoulder panel geometry," Evelyn said. "From my gown. You're developing that principle into a full structural premise." "Yes." "Over how many pieces?" 12, 14 if the technical problems I haven't solved yet get solved the way I think they will. Evelyn was quiet. Then, "The buyers are going to fight over the third piece. Whatever the third piece is. It will be the most technically demanding, and they'll know it, and they'll want to own it." Zariah looked at her. "I don't have a third piece yet." "You will." She said it with the same certainty she'd brought to everything, the certainty that had built a company from an atelier table and had survived whatever the body was currently doing, and had spent 8 months building an evidentiary case while receiving treatment, and had asked Zariah tonight to bring the collection to her before it went anywhere else. You'll have it, and it'll be the best one, and they're going to fight over it. Zariah looked at the woman in the bed, at the lines in her face that were age and illness, and the specific gravity of having built something real over a long time, at the intelligence behind the eyes that was still fully present and fully sharp, and looking at Zariah with the attention of someone who recognized what they were looking at. I'll bring you the sketch, Zariah said. When the third piece exists, you'll see the sketch first. Evelyn held her gaze. I'll hold you to that. She left the room and went down the restored-to-normal main staircase and through the front hall and out the door into the cold that was the estate's grounds at 2 a.m, and she stood on the stone steps and breathed the night air, which was damp and cold and smelled of wet grass and the season's edge and the particular cleanness that a city's periphery holds in the hours before dawn. The car was waiting, the same driver, the same silence. She got in. They drove back toward the city through the dark, and she sat with her hand in her blazer pocket and the drive in her hand and her head against the window, watching the suburb give way to the grid, the trees receding and the streetlights accumulating and the city reassembling itself around the car as they moved deeper into it. She thought about the collection, the opening piece, the third piece that didn't exist yet. She thought about Evelyn's voice. You'll have it. She thought about the studio, the West Loop building, the 4th floor with good light that she hadn't seen and hadn't agreed to and was going to look at before she decided anything. She thought about this morning. Marcus. The long explanation over food. His face when she got to the part about the ballroom. She could already see it, the specific expression he'd wear when he understood what she'd walked into and chosen to stay in, which would be the expression that said, I cannot believe you, and of course you did simultaneously, and which was the expression that meant she was entirely known by at least one person in the world, and that knowing was not a burden but a structure that had held for 29 years and would hold tomorrow and after. The drive was solid in her hand. The city was all light now, the full grid of it, the south side materializing in the distance as they moved through the interchange, and she looked at it. Not the north, not the architectural display of glass and height that Chicago showed to the people who could afford to live inside it, but south, the part she knew, the part where she'd grown up and worked and built in a spare bedroom what it had taken tonight to bring into the world. She looked south the way she always looked, the way she'd told him at the window. Nobody looks north when they grew up south. She was still looking at it when the car stopped outside her building and the driver said nothing, and she understood that she was home, that there were people who'd ensured the building was clear and safe, and that the night was over, and that in the morning there would be attorneys and filings and the beginning of a legal process that was going to be long and visible and contested, and that her name was going to be on documents in rooms she'd never been in before. And that the life she was stepping back into when she opened this car door was categorically different from the life she'd left to go downtown in the rain 2 nights ago. She got out of the car. She stood on the sidewalk on 73rd and King Drive, roughly, give or take, in the damp cold of the early morning with her blazer and her portfolio and the drive in her pocket and the collection already building itself in her mind. The opening piece, the structural premise, the tension in the geometry that resolved at the surface and was invisible until it wasn't. The driver waited until she was inside the building. She climbed the 2 flights, she unlocked her door, she turned on the lights, all of them, every one, and stood in the center of her apartment in the converted spare bedroom and the small living room and the kitchen with the bad overhead lighting, and she breathed. The cutting table, the sewing machine she'd fixed twice, the designs pinned to the wall above the table, the working drawings, the evidence of a decade of process. She crossed to the table. She sat down. She pulled a piece of drafting paper from the stack and a pencil from the cup. She began to draw. Not the opening piece. She'd known the opening piece for 3 years. She didn't need to draw it tonight. She drew the third piece, the one that didn't exist yet. She drew it the way she'd told Evelyn she would find it, through the technical problems, through the structure, through the geometry that had to work before the surface would tell the truth. She drew until the windows went gray, and then pale, and then the specific gold of early Chicago morning, and the city woke up around her, and the night moved off in the direction nights move when they're finished, and the third piece began to exist on the paper in front of her with the clarity of something that had always been waiting for the conditions in which to arrive. She was still drawing when the sun came fully up. Her name was on the paper. This time, it would stay there.